Now, Wadan, for more than 7 odd years, your Fiji Time articles have been warning about the massive increase in public debt. Now, as I say, blind Freddy would have taken heed of your warnings. However, can you first explain to the viewer what is it about the public debt that is so potentially harmful for future generations? I believe this is a very important explanation that you could give to the people of Fiji.
Okay, all right. Okay, let us take a normal family in Fiji,
Hmm.
right? Let's call him, Joe Turanga, right? He has a certain income and a certain expenditure. He wants to do something, in his house or his small business or whatever. So he goes and borrows money from a bank, right? That loan must be repaid every year, maybe for 10 years. Now, that loan must be repaid, which includes a principal element and an interest element, right? That's how the banks calculate it, right? And that must be paid every year out of his revenue. And then what is left after that payment of the bank loan is then available to fund his consumption, his education of his children, health expenses, and so on. But the public debt charges must be paid first. And if he wants to spend more, he's got to borrow more and increase his public debt more. So the country is exactly like that. Fiji is a country, right? It has got a government budget, it's got a revenue coming in, and it's got an expenditure. So if you look at the budget documents every year, right on the first page of the budget documents, you'll see charges on public debt, which is the principal and interest payments. And they must come out first before the country can spend on education, on health, on infrastructure, roads, water. Now, if the public debt becomes too big, right? The public debt becomes too big, then he has got to the government has to squeeze the expenditure. You got to spend less on education, on health, and all that. Now, most countries they borrow. I mean, Australia has been borrowing money for 100 years, but they spend money on wisely. The GDP per capita, the incomes of the country have been growing in proportion, and when the economy grows, government revenue goes in proportion. So governments over here are able to pay for the public debt and whatever they need on an increasing level. In Fiji, what we have done in the last 7 years, they have spent a huge amount of money, all on borrowed money, which this government is not having to pay for now. This government will depart after the next election, then they will fly away to their safety zones. Who will pay for it? And this is the strangest part of public debt, Sashi. How on earth, how on earth can you as an individual borrow from the bank and tell the bank, oh, don't worry, mate. If I can't pay the public debt, my children will pay for it.
Mm.
It's fine. Yeah, it usually happens. But this is different. When a government says, oh, I'm going to borrow from ADB, World Bank, from China, from everywhere and all that, from FNPF and all that. But if we can't pay it, ah, the future generation, everybody else, will pay for it next year, the year after that, the year after. I mean, it's an incredibly sacred power that governments have to borrow on behalf of taxpayers who must pay it. Not them, not today's taxpayers, future taxpayers. And if
Mhm.
they can't pay it, right, at some point in time, they've got to borrow more. So you see, I can see in yesterday's newspaper, Ayaz is planning to borrow $1 more billion from outside sources. Well, the trouble with borrowing from foreign sources, Sashi, is this. You borrow locally from FNPF, and you might borrow too much from them. You can always pay them in Fiji dollars. If necessary, the government can print money and pay FNPF in Fiji dollars. Of course, that would create inflation, and everybody's savings and money would devalue in money, right? But when you borrow from ADB, from World Bank, from commercial banks overseas like ANZ or anything, they don't want pieces of Fijian paper. They want foreign exchange. And if you don't have foreign exchange, tough luck. Your credit rating will go down. You'll have to devalue your currency. It'll be an absolutely disastrous thing for everybody's cost of living, because all of us, depend on imported goods and services for our living expenses and living standards and all that. And if you go too far, you'll become like Greece and Portugal. The entire economy is collapsed because they couldn't repay their public debt. So public debt is a time bomb. You got to manage it. And there are some countries in the world, Sashi, where the Reserve Bank, is given powers to say that public debt must not exceed this proportion of GDP. It must not exceed that. And they force governments to live within their means. But this government has refused to live within its means. It's kept on spending wildly, right? It refused to, even when COVID hit, there were people in the tourism industry being sent home by their employers, right? Zero incomes. This country, right? They refused to actually have a job keeper allowance like Australia or job seeker allowance, right? They refuse to cut anybody's incomes, including, of course, you look at the prime minister's salary. The guy said no military officer will benefit from this coup. Well, my goodness, he increased his salary from below 100,000 to above 300,000, right? He gives himself a per diem in excess of, $2,500 a day. No Australian and New Zealand prime minister has ever got this kind of expenses ever in the history. And we've got a very, very greedy set of people who actually have feathered their own nest, and at the expense of taxpayers. So the public debt is a very sacred thing. Governments should not misuse it, and this government has misused it.